So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be back here at IASA, where I spent 3 wonderful years as a postdoc working together with the co-authors of this presentation, Joan Bayer and Mike Thompson, and with many other colleagues at the Risk Policy and Vulnerability Program. So this talk, as you can read it in title, From Stakeholder Views to Policy Options, suggests that we really need to start from understanding what are the stakeholders' needs, options, opinion, attitudes, if we have to achieve a policy effectiveness. But why do we need to take into account these stakeholder views? This is an example of an opposition to a new electricity power line. And a good reason to take into account the stakeholder views before the decision is made is to avoid this to happen. It took 11 years to build a new transmission line in this case, where the mean average time is 5 to 7 years. And we have a lot of many other cases where opposition, strong opposition and conflict are hindering the results of many years of research and assessments for, in this case, deciding where are we gonna put the new transmission line. So evidence increasingly shows that engaging more with stakeholders before the decision is made can diffuse conflict, decrease opposition, and help to highlight new options and bring actually new scientific and social options into light. But what is research, and what are we at in research about these topics? So in the past days, a number of quotes from previous presenters really set the stage for some of the key topics of this presentation. So we started with our Raifa with his short but very effective message, underlying how progress has been less than desirable on integrating methodology and real decision problems. Another interesting journey was the one that we did with Beth on marine ecosystem modeling and fishing in Australia. And we saw a disappointment in the level of distrust from the models that have been produced by our group in the research. And another quote is from Jill Yeager that was underlying that to do some transformative research, we need to focus more on solution and not only on problems. But the key question was solution to what type of visions and to the visions of what stakeholders. And finally, yesterday, it is important to work with policymakers, stakeholders, from the beginning to the end, in order for results to be used at the end of the scientific assessment. So starting from this fil rouge among different topics related to stakeholder engagement, I will address 2 challenges with my presentation. The first one is related to the co-production of knowledge between stakeholder experts and policymakers. There are an increasing number of studies showing different approaches on how stakeholders' qualitative views, and narratives, and storyline should be included into scientific modeling or into options identified with the support of scientific knowledge. But how can we address this social diversity and include this heterogeneous view into policy options? This will be the first topic. And the second one is about the end of stakeholder engagement processes. Are we really reaching agreement? Are we really reaching a compromise? Are we really conciliating all these different views of the stakeholder that we engage? So in order to present some reflections on these two challenges, I will describe the results of a case study on landslide risk management and mitigation in southern Italy. So this was conducted in the framework of an interdisciplinary project funded by the European Commission. And in this project, we really wanted to engage with stakeholders to find out a compromise solution for an existing landslide risk mitigation problem. And the problem is depicted in this slide. When we started our fieldwork, there was a policy stalemate in this beautiful city in southern Italy, in the Campania region. 40,000 inhabitants, 4,000 residents at high risk of landslides. So another case of a stalemate is the opposition that I described at the beginning. So, and here the stalemate was that a risk mitigation project produced by the experts at the regional level was fiercely opposed by the local population, and it was actually rejected by the municipal council office. The reason of this opposition and this rejection have to be found in the history of past events in the area. I will go into the detail of this story, but the point is that in this case, the flow of knowledge was one way from the expert, this emergency commissariat, to the decision makers. And it didn't work because in this specific case, there was a landslide in the nearby town of Sarno, and they built a number of structural passive measures. The new project, Fornociera Inferiore, prepared by the same group of experts, was highly opposed for the reason that they didn't want to end up like in Sarno, having landslides, almost 200 people dying, and having also spent a lot of public funding for risk mitigation. So we wanted to do something different, and we wanted to unstuck this situation with our research work. And the first step to do so was to address the social diversity and the heterogeneous view of stakeholders. So the preparatory work consisted in a number of questionnaire surveys with the resident. We involved more than 500. It consisted in focus group with the decision makers and the stakeholders and interviews. So one of the results of this preparatory phase is this map of the stakeholders. Here you can see clearly that there are not only many stakeholders involved, but that there are some difficulties arising when authorities at the national level have responsibility for risk mitigation up down to the municipal level. So the issue of scale that has been already addressed by many other presenters. In this case, the vertical cooperation was completely missing between the regional level and the authorities responsible for risk mitigation there and the municipal level. And I want just to emphasize a couple of other problems that emerge when you start to address the diversity of stakeholders. And by interviewing all these people, some plague in the risk mitigation decision-making process emerged. This plague are related to illegal building in risky area, for example, in this part of Italy. These were related to the lack of funding, to the unfair distribution of funding based on different criteria for risk assessment. So this was somehow the starting point to address the diversity. But let's see into detail what were the different views of stakeholders. I will make here, of course, only some example using the excerpts of some interviews. For example, we have a resident that was emphasizing the need for an expert and public authorities guarantee of a very high level of safety. Available public resources should be spent to really guarantee safety for those at risk. We have a completely different view from an NGO member that was, for him, the priority was obviously to preserve the ecosystem of the mountain area. for him, expensive structural measures were really representing a major problem. And then we have another more rational sort of view of the municipal technical officers grounding their decision on cost-benefit analysis and relocation. Another example to account for this diversity that we discussed about, this is only one of the results, of the multiple results of the questionnaire service, but we asked the resident what do they think are the priority actions for risk mitigation in the area. And as you can see here, territory maintenance and monitoring was considered a high priority. The history of structural risk mitigation works received very little success. And so we started to really understand how the ideas were linked together too. So how the stakeholders were building up views with ideas consistently related to each other. So before I start with the actual participatory process and this co-production of knowledge process, I will just briefly mention the outreach activities that we organized and that were very important to enlarge the representativity of the number of stakeholders and that we involved during the process and to actually reach a broader audience. Of course, the social media nowadays play a very important role in reaching wider publics. And this is just an example to show you the enthusiasm of the stakeholders that took part in our process. So they prepared this video to invite the other residents of the area to participate through the website by proposing inputs to the results of the various meetings that we had. So there was an offline and an online process going on at the same time. Here you can see our first meeting where we organized a public meeting to explain our project and to select the participants. There is an NGO member that was very interactively asking questions about risk mitigation. And here there is all the group work that we organized and facilitated with more or less conflicting issues. And so that's just to give you an idea on how stakeholder engagement needs to try to reach different mini and macro publics nowadays to be actually consistent with our social needs and changes. So the first meeting that we had was aimed at better understanding the discourses and the views of the different stakeholders. Basically, how the ideas that I mentioned before are coupled together in our minds. The results of this meeting allowed us to identify three main discourses. We labeled them safety first, careful stewardship, and rational choice. And in order to construct these discourses, we grounded on the theory of plural rationalities, which basically states that there are three main ways to look at risk: hierarchical, egalitarian, and individualist. And for example, in the case of the safety first discourse, which reflect a hierarchical view, these people were very much trusting experts and local authorities to make the right decision. They had a very top-down approach to decision. It's them that have to ensure us the highest level of protection possible. And they were in favor of a mix of structural measures, but also a bit of natural engineering measures. People with an egalitarian view that are very strident and critical in their voices had a completely different ideas. For them, structural measures were the problem, not the solution. And they were really wishing to have a careful stewardship of the mountain as the main and best alternative to mitigate the risk on the slope. And finally, we have the individualistic, very rational discourse. We need to have criteria, we need to have cost effectiveness, and we need to base everything on a rational choice. maybe the best solution is to relocate the residents. And who cares if they don't want to be relocated? So, and let's go at the core of the translation of stakeholder views into policy option. The core was this co-production process with our local partners and engineers that basically helped us in this translational discourse, which consisted in transforming these qualitative views and inputs and narratives and storyline in something very, how can I say, concrete, pragmatic, some risk mitigation planning. So here I won't go into detail in describing each of those, but you can just see that for each discourse, there was a different proportion of measures, structural and non-structural, to mitigate the risk on the slope. I will go more into detail in one of these perspectives, just to let you understand the type of work that we did. And this is the work done mostly by our engineers, colleagues, and they were doing a lot of hazard and risk assessment. They were doing a lot of cost-benefit analysis. They were doing a residual risk analysis to prepare all these options and compare the costs and see how much do we want to really invest in the warning system and in the emergency planning to save these people's life, or how much do we want to invest in structural mitigation measures and so on. In this case, the highlight was the park at the base of the mountain, as you can see here, which was aimed at entirely protecting this area and avoiding to build new households there. So the third meeting after this one, where we highlighted the diversity in qualitative and quantitative terms, was aimed at working in groups. Here we could have used a lot of different tools. For sure, the multi-objective, multi-stakeholder analysis that was presented before could have been a good option. In our case, we decided to let the like-minded people work together to identify priorities. So what do we consider to be the most important thing to do to mitigate the risk? So the results of this working group show some area of agreement and disagreement. The triangle is a clumsy solution space, and we have collected a very high number of agreement on priorities related to the so-called non-structural measures, including warning system, emergency planning, forestal assessment plans, and all these measures that are not extremely expensive, but can help to save lives in case of an event. A lot of agreement also on the active measures, this engineering, very low impacting solution, but much less discussion on relocation and the structural measures. So the discussion on these two topics became very heated for some of the issues that also were mentioned by other presenters, the tragedy of the commons, when we have public and private interests conflicting to each other, as in the case of relocation. It was very difficult to reach an agreement. And the same was true for the case of passive mitigation measure. In case of risk mitigation, really the key point was not much how much we weighted this criteria and so on, but it was more where all these measures are going to be located. So, and then we spent a lot of time with a number of meetings and parallel meetings and online discussion and so on to reach a compromise solution among these different views, grounded, of course, on the priority identified before. So here you can see the proposals of, again, an expert-supported, facilitated compromise. Of course, there are a lot of details in these slides on all the type of measures to be built where and so on, and I won't go into detail now here. Just one point, we decided to completely exclude the relocation option because the conflict was very harsh. But on the other options, we discussed a lot where to locate these passive measures related a lot to issues of fairness. Who are we going to protect more? Who are we going to protect less? And so on. And so this was basically the final and compromise solution. So to go back to the 2 points that I mentioned at the beginning, so what are the lessons learned from all this process that lasted for 3 years? The first one relates to this co-production of the policy option for risk mitigation. By involving the stakeholders at the beginning and asking them, what do you think about the risk? What are the causes? What are the consequences? What would you do? We guaranteed a stakeholder ownership of the process that helped us to face conflict in a different way during the entire process. So experts and stakeholders co-produce this policy option, and as you have seen in the previous slides, the discussion around the compromise solution actually highlighted a new option that we didn't consider before. So the final result was something different than what we have considered at the beginning. So one of the sort of philosophical and the theoretical standpoint of this process, on which we can maybe discuss about later, was the respect for heterogeneity. So we didn't try to change stakeholders' preferences and their views during the process. And actually what we observed was that very few people changed their mind in the end. Actually, most of them didn't, especially those that were living on the toe. They actually reinforced their opinion on what were the priorities for risk mitigation. And then the second point that I raised at the beginning, how do these processes end? So reaching a compromise in a contested policy terrain is always a challenge. And in our case, facilitation across this co-produced policy option made, of course, the difference. And the other aspect that was quite intense was this continuous interaction with stakeholder and participant, which is a challenge to face if we want to do more co-production of knowledge in policy making. And of course, for me, a main lesson learned was that our chances for innovation really rely on this integration of knowledge and in collaboration. So what are the future opportunities and possibilities, and how could we have done it better somehow? We could have explored the synergy with other decision analytical techniques, like negotiation theory, multi-criteria assessment, and other techniques that can help to solve the issues of stakeholder engagement and of modeling on the side of the expert and the scientific knowledge that is brought in these processes in different ways. And I'm looking forward for the next presentation, which will be also on these issues like robust decision making in the next session. And I thank you very much for your attention.